However, when the article I collected in the end, leave your thoughts in the comments, like.
My sister appeared on my doorstep wearing a shirt that wasn't hers and delivered a line that destroyed my belief in coincidences forever. He said, "You never liked this color anyway, so it's no loss." Behind her, sheets of rain fell like a solid wall, turning the world into a washed-out watercolor, while the smell of wet asphalt and rotting autumn leaves invaded the hallway before I could fully grasp the meaning of her words. The shirt wasn't just someone else's, it was blue Oxford cloth with a tiny, barely visible ink stain on the left cuff, a stain I had tried to remove 3 years ago. Mark had thrown a fit back then, claiming I'd ruined his favorite item, and had theatrically tossed it into the donation bag. Now, that piece of garbage was draped over Alina's shoulders, which were too broad for her fragile frame, the top button undone just enough to reveal that she wasn't wearing a bra. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, heavy as a stone, but instead of slamming the door, I took a step back, letting her into our pristine, sterile home. "Come in, you'll catch a cold," I said, my voice sounding hollow, as if I were speaking from underwater. It was the first betrayal of myself in the long chain of events that followed. Alina walked in, leaving dirty tracks on the parquet, and that sound, the wet squelch of sneakers against expensive wood, echoed through me like physical pain. In Mark's house, you couldn't make a mess, you couldn't make noise, you couldn't disrupt the geometry of the space, yet my sister moved as if those rules had been written for everyone but her. She tossed her bag onto the beige sofa, the one I was only allowed to sit on in loungewear, and began rubbing her chilled hands. I stared at the ink stain on the cuff. It looked like an eye, winking at me from the past. "Is Mark coming back soon?" she asked casually, looking around with a predatory curiosity I had once mistaken for childlike wonder. The air filled with her scent, cheap vanilla mixed with tobacco, overpowering the subtle aroma of lemongrass Mark had chosen for our diffuser. I nodded, feeling a spasm constrict my throat, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, trying to convince myself that the shirt had simply missed the charity bin, that Mark might have given it to someone else, and Alina had found it by accident. But my logic was unraveling like old stitching. When the front door lock clicked, 2 turns, a pause, 1 more turn, a ritual I knew by heart, I froze, cup in hand. Mark entered, shaking drops from his umbrella with pedantic, calculated movements. His gaze landed immediately on Alina. I expected irritation, disgust, that cold politeness with which he usually greeted my relatives, whom he referred to as chaotic elements. Instead, for a split second, his face relaxed and a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes before he pulled on his usual mask of the weary host. "Alina? This is unexpected," he said evenly, hanging up his coat. No questions about the shirt. No surprise that the item he supposedly hated was now on my sister. He walked past me, barely brushing my shoulder, a mechanical gesture, devoid of warmth, like punching a time card. I caught the scent of his skin, cold, citrusy, but beneath it lay something else, faint but distinct, the same thing my sister had brought in, damp humidity and sweet tobacco. My fingers gripped the ceramic mug so hard my knuckles turned white. I stood in the center of my own kitchen feeling like a spare prop in a play that had been rehearsed without me. Dinner was a torture of sensory overload. The clatter of silverware against china seemed deafening, the light from the designer chandelier too bright, searing my retinas. Alina ate greedily, with an appetite Mark had always called vulgar, but now he simply poured her more wine, watching the movement of her lips with clinical interest. They talked about things that meant nothing to an outsider, old movies, the weather, traffic on the bridge, but there was a double meaning slipping through their intonations. "Remember how the hero in that movie hid the evidence in the freezer?" Alina smirked, stabbing a piece of steak. Mark smiled, not with his eyes, just the corners of his mouth. "Amateur move. Real professionals hide things in plain sight." I sat opposite them, tasting metal in my mouth even though I was only eating salad. Suddenly, I remembered how, a year ago, Mark had convinced me to quit my job because I was too stressed and needed peace. Back then, it felt like care. Now, watching their synchronized movements, she raised her glass, he took a sip, I saw it as isolation. I was locked in a golden cage, and the keys, it seemed, had been handed to my sister. Why was she here? Why in his shirt? Why was I too afraid to ask out loud? That night, I didn't sleep, listening to the silence of the house, which had suddenly turned hostile. Mark lay beside me, his breathing rhythmic and deep, but his body felt like a coiled spring. I carefully slipped out from under the heavy duvet, stepping barefoot onto the icy floor, and crept into the living room where Alina was sleeping on the sofa. In the moonlight, her face looked serene, almost angelic, were it not for Mark's shirt crumpled on the floor next to her things. I picked it up and brought it to my face, inhaling the scent of the fabric. Cedar. Vanilla. And something else, the specific smell of leather from the interior of his new car, the one he bought a month ago and told me I shouldn't sit in yet, so as not to stain the upholstery. I felt sick. This wasn't just an old shirt. This was something worn recently. Inside the pocket, I felt something hard. A tiny receipt from a car wash on the outskirts of town. Date, yesterday. Time, noon. At noon, Mark was supposed to be in a meeting, and Alina in another city. The puzzle pieces clicked together with nauseating clarity, but the main piece was missing. Why had they come to me? Why this performance? The next 3 days dissolved into a viscous nightmare where reality melted under the heat of gaslighting. When I asked Mark about the receipt, he didn't blink. He told me I must have mixed up the dates or found some old trash. You've been so scattered lately, darling, he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Maybe you should start taking those pills again? Alina, sitting in the kitchen in my robe, chimed in with feigned pity. Yes, sis, you look exhausted. You're imagining things. They operated as a seamless team, tossing the ball of my sanity back and forth. I began to doubt myself. Was I really losing my mind? Maybe the shirt really was old? I caught myself staring at my reflection for long periods, trying to find signs of madness, but all I saw was fear. The house became plagued with glitches, the internet would cut out, lights flickered, my things went missing, my favorite mug, keys, important documents. Every time, Mark would find them in the most ridiculous places, shaking his head reproachfully. I felt the ground slipping beneath me, turning into the quicksand of their lies. The breaking point came on Thursday when I decided to wash Alina's clothes while she was in the shower. It was a petty, humiliating desire to find something to prove I was right. In the pocket of her jeans, I found not a love note, not condoms, but a set of keys. One was long, with jagged, complex teeth, a bank safe deposit box key. I recognized it because Mark had an identical one. He kept it in the safe in his study. My heart hammered in my throat, cutting off my oxygen. I rushed to the study, my trembling hands punching in the safe code. Our wedding date, how ironic. The safe was empty. No deed to the house, no savings, no key. Just dust. I knelt before the open door, and the realization hit me like a wave of ice water. This wasn't infidelity in the classic sense. This was a robbery. They weren't just sleeping together, they were planning to strip my life down to the foundation, had me declared incompetent so no one would believe a word I said. I returned to the kitchen, feeling a cold, crystalline rage spread through me, replacing the panic. It was sharp as a scalpel and clear as glass. I heard the water running in the shower. Alina was washing off the dirt, but the filth was inside her. I picked up my phone but didn't call the police. Mark was a lawyer. He'd twist everything so I'd be hauled off to a clinic that same evening. I needed to be subtler. I remembered his obsession with control, his paranoia about security. His tablet, which he had carelessly left charging, had the smart home app open. I went into the settings. The cameras. They recorded audio. I rewound the footage 2 hours. Kitchen. Mark and Alina. She's almost ready, Mark's voice sounded bored. A couple more breakdowns, and I'll file for guardianship. You promised we'd sell the house by Christmas, Alina's tone was petulant. We will. As soon as the incapacity papers are signed. I copied the recording to the cloud, then emailed it to the senior partner at his firm, adding the subject line, conflict of interest and fraud with client assets. Then I opened the banking app. I still had access to the joint account they planned to drain tomorrow. I'd heard the date on the recording. My fingers flew across the screen, executing the only correct move. I didn't transfer the money to myself. That would look suspicious. I transferred the entire sum, our savings from 5 years, to the IRS to pay off a non-existent debt from Mark's firm, which I fabricated in the payment reference. Getting that money back would be a bureaucratic hell lasting years. I had destroyed their jackpot. I had made their victory worthless. In that moment, I felt the chemical composition of my blood change. I was transforming from victim to executioner. When Mark returned that evening, I met him wearing that same blue shirt, draped casually over black lingerie. It was a calculated visual strike. I watched his pupils contract, scanning the fabric, trying to understand why the item he threw away was back, and why I looked not like a broken hysteric, but like a woman in charge. Alina froze in the doorway of the living room, her fingers nervously picking at the hem of her t-shirt. In that gesture, I saw the first sign of fear. She instinctively sensed the shift in the atmosphere, like an animal sensing a storm. On the table, a perfect dinner steamed, rare roast beef, its scent mingling with the aroma of expensive red wine, the bottle we had been saving for our anniversary, which I had uncorked half an hour ago. Celebrating? Mark asked, hanging his coat with caution. His voice held a fake softness, masking the wariness of a predator who smells a trap. I smiled slowly, just with my lips, and handed him a glass, enjoying the slight tremor in his hand as our fingers touched. The glass was cold, but my skin burned with adrenaline. Celebrating, I replied, looking him straight in the eye. I solved that financial problem you were so worried about. A heavy, electrified silence hung in the air, broken only by the ticking clock counting down the seconds to his ruin. His phone, lying screen up on the marble countertop, vibrated, a short, sharp sound, like the death rattle of an insect. It was a notification from the bank, followed by a second one from the tax service, and finally, a call from the senior partner, whose name lit up the display in bright white letters. Mark went pale so rapidly it looked as if all the blood had been drained from him. He grabbed the phone, his eyes scanning the text, and the wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering into hundreds of ruby shards across the beige carpet. The stain spread like a fresh wound. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a screech. Alina darted toward him, peering at the screen, and I watched her face contort in horror. Zero balance, transaction confirmation, a message accusing him of unethical conduct. "You transferred everything? Have you lost your mind?" she screamed, forgetting her role as the caring sister. Her mask slipped, revealing a greedy, frightened stranger. I stood motionless, observing their panic with cold scientific interest, like an entomologist studying the agony of beetles in a jar. "I just paid your debts to conscience, darling," I said quietly, stepping over the shards. "And now, you'd better answer your partner. He hates waiting." The scene that unfolded next was pathetic and repulsive. They turned on each other, forgetting I was even there. Mark screamed at Alina that she had rushed him, that her greed had ruined everything. My sister shrieked back that he was a loser who couldn't keep his own wife on a leash. I walked into the hallway, picked up the bag I'd packed earlier, just documents, my laptop, and an old photo of my parents, and put on my trench coat. The house I had once polished so diligently had turned into a cage with an open door, and the smell of vanilla and men's cologne now only made me nauseous. I heard Mark hurl his phone against the wall, heard something heavy crash to the floor, but my heart beat steadily, tapping out the rhythm of freedom. On the threshold, I turned back. Mark sat on the floor amidst the glass and wine, head in his hands, destroyed by his own arrogance. "By the way," I threw out, already opening the door into the rainy night. "That shirt never suited you. Blue is the color of trust, and you have none." 8 months later, I am sitting on the terrace of a small cafe in the old city center. It smells of ground coffee and wet cobblestones, and the scent seems like the cleanest thing in the world. The morning sun plays in my glass of orange juice, and I squint at the light, which no longer feels aggressive. My phone lies face down on the table, a habit that's hard to break. But now I don't flinch at every notification. Mark was disbarred, the proceedings were loud and dirty, and his reputation burned to the ground, just like his bank accounts. I haven't heard anything about Alina, nor do I want to. She stayed back there, in the past, along with the ink stain and other women's husbands. I adjust the cuff of my new, impeccably white blouse, bought with my own money, and take a sip. A man walks by, accidentally bumping my table, and his apology sounds sincere. I nod to him, calm and steady. I no longer believe in coincidences, but now I know the exact value of things, people, and most importantly, my own intuition, which has learned to distinguish love from a perfectly planned crime.